Imagine standing on a frozen airfield in the dead of winter. The Soviet steppe is a landscape of endless white and shadow. The temperature has plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, a cold so biting that it feels like needles against any exposed skin. You are 19 years old. Your hands are raw. Your eyes are heavy with exhaustion, and you are climbing into the cockpit of a plane that looks like it belongs in a history book from the previous century. It is made of plywood. Its wings are covered in nothing but painted canvas. You have no radio to call for help, no parachute to save your life if things go wrong, and no radar to find your way through the pitch-black night. Your mission is to fly directly into the heart of the most advanced military machine the world has ever seen. This wasn't a nightmare, and it wasn't a suicide mission. This was the nightly reality for the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. History remembers them by a name. Their enemies gave them out of pure, shivering terror. The Night Witches. To truly understand how these women ended up in the sky, we have to look at the sheer desperation of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa had smashed through the borders, and the Red Army was reeling. The German Luftwaffe owned the skies. Amidst this chaos, Marina Raskova, a famous aviator often called the Soviet Amelia Earhart, began receiving thousands of letters from women across the country. These weren't just letters of support. They were demands. These women didn't want to just work in the factories or dig trenches. They wanted to fight. They wanted to fly. Raskova used her personal influence with Joseph Stalin to do something that had never been done in modern warfare. She formed 3 all-female aviation regiments. While other nations used women for transport or ferry pilots, the Soviet Union was the first to send them directly into combat. Of the 3 units formed, the 588th was the most unique. It remained exclusively female, from the pilots and navigators to the mechanics and the ground commanders. Every bolt tightened and every bomb loaded was done by a woman. But the Soviet military leadership was still skeptical. They didn't give these women the new fast Yak fighters or the Armadillo. Instead, they handed them the Polikarpov Po-2. If you saw a Po-2 today, you'd think it was a museum piece. It was a 1920s design biplane intended for dusting crops and training student pilots. It was slow, painfully slow. Its top speed was barely 90 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, the German Messerschmitt fighters they were up against flew at well over 300 miles per hour. The Po-2 offered zero protection. The cockpit was open to the freezing wind, meaning the pilots had to endure the brutal Russian winter with nothing but leather coats and fur-lined boots. The fabric skin was highly flammable. A single tracer bullet or a spark from an anti-aircraft shell could turn the whole plane into a funeral pyre in seconds. And because the planes were so small and light, they couldn't carry a heavy bomb load. They could only carry 2 bombs at a time, one under each wing. So, how do you make an impact with a crop duster that carries only 2 bombs? The answer was sheer, relentless persistence. A typical night for a night which wasn't just one mission. It was a grueling cycle. They would take off, fly to the target, drop their 2 bombs, fly back, land in the dark, reload, refuel, and take off again. On a single night, a pilot might fly 8, 10, or even 18 missions. They were essentially a human conveyor belt of destruction that never stopped until the sun began to rise. This constant bombardment had a devastating effect on the German soldiers below. Imagine trying to sleep in a trench, knowing that at any second, a bomb could drop from a silent sky. This is where the name Nachthexen or Night Witches comes from. The pilots developed a terrifyingly effective technique. As they approached the German lines, they would cut their engines while still miles away. They would glide in total silence, a ghost in the air. The only sound the Germans could hear was the eerie, soft whistling of the wind passing through the wire struts of the biplane's wings. To the men on the ground, that sound resembled the sweeping of a witch's broomstick. By the time they heard that whistle, it was already too late. The bombs were released, and the pilot would restart her engine only after the explosion, disappearing back into the darkness before the searchlights could find her. The psychological toll on the Germans was so immense that rumors began to circulate through the Nazi ranks. Some soldiers believed the Soviet government was experimenting on these women, giving them special pills or injections that gave them the night vision of a cat. In reality, it wasn't medicine. It was incredible skill, raw courage, and the ability to navigate by nothing but the stars and a hand-drawn map. The fear was so great that the German High Command issued a decree. Any soldier who shot down a Knight, which was automatically awarded the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor. But the bravery of the 588th wasn't just found in their bombing runs. It was found in their day-to-day survival. These women lived in conditions that would have broken the toughest veteran soldiers. They slept in holes in the ground or in crowded tents. They often had to use their own bodies to shield their planes from the wind and snow. Because they were women in a male-dominated military, they were often given oversized menace uniforms and boots that they had to stuff with torn-up bedding just to make them fit. They also faced a horrifying choice every time they took off. The choice between weight and safety. Because the Pucci was so underpowered, the pilots often flew without parachutes. A parachute weighed about 20 pounds, and to a Night Witch, that was 20 pounds of weight that could be used for an extra incendiary device or more fuel. This meant that if their plane was hit and caught fire, which happened often due to the canvas and wood construction, they had no way out. They could either stay with the plane and burn, or jump to their death. One of the most famous pilots, Nadezhda Popova, once recalled a mission where she looked over at her wingman's plane only to see it erupt in flames. She had to watch her friends disappear into the dark as a ball of fire, knowing there was absolutely nothing she could do to help them. When Popova herself returned from that same mission, she found 42 bullet holes in her plane. Her map was shredded, and her flight goggles were shattered. She didn't ask for a day off. She didn't ask for a transfer. She drank a cup of hot tea, waited for the mechanics to patch the holes with tape and glue, and went back up for her next run. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment eventually flew over 30,000 missions throughout the war. They dropped over 23,000 tons of explosives on German positions. They participated in some of the most critical battles of the Eastern Front, including the liberation of the Crimea and the final push into Germany. By the end of the war, they had become the most decorated female unit in the entire Soviet Air Force. 23 of these women were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Gold Star, the highest distinction the country could offer. However, the end of the war brought a different kind of challenge. Despite their incredible record, the 588th wasn't invited to fly in the Great Victory Parade in Moscow. The official reason was that their planes were too slow. But the underlying reality was that the Soviet military was returning to its traditional roots. The unit was disbanded, and many of these legendary pilots were told to go back to their homes, get married, and forget their time in the sky. But you cannot forget women like that. They didn't have the fastest planes, the best technology, or even the basic protection of a parachute. They had a wooden biplane held together by wire and a level of grit that changed the course of history. They proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to fly directly into it, engine off, gliding through the dark. The legacy of the Night Witches lives on as a reminder of what is possible when people are pushed to the absolute limit. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters who transformed themselves into the most feared pilots of the Eastern Front. They took the tools they were given, no matter how humble, and used them to reclaim their skies. When you look up at the stars on a quiet night and hear the wind whistling through the trees, think of the 588th. Think of the young women in the open cockpits, navigating by the stars, defying an empire with nothing but plywood wings and a silent engine. They were the Night Witches, and they owned the night when the world was at its darkest. Their story isn't just a story of war, it's a story of the human spirit's refusal to be grounded.